You know we are not done with the mid-year content until we get to my favourite videos talking about all of the series that I've read so far this year. As always, I'm going to be splitting this video into two. So in this installment, we will be talking about the 15 series that I have either finished, DNF'd, or I'm currently up to date on at the halfway point of the year. And then the next installment, which you will be seeing at some point within the next week, are all of the series that I have read from or started this year that I have not finished, or if they're still currently publishing, have not caught up with all of the installments that are currently out and available to read. Every year we talk about my progress in comparison to the previous year, and I have some good things to report. We typically want to increase the amount of series that we talk about in this video because this is all of the stuff that's like wrapped up or has some sort of conclusion, and we want less books to be in the next installment because we don't want to be starting series and not continuing on with them, which I have still been doing a lot of in 2026, but we do have some improvements. So at this point last year in this first installment, we talked about 17 series. We are talking about 2 less today with 15, but 12 of the series from last year were ones that I DNF'd. So I'd read the first installment or one of the sequels and decided that I didn't want to continue. This year, we only have 5 DNFs, which I think is a definite improvement on that number. And then for the follow-up video last year, I think once again, we spoke about 18 series that I needed to continue on with, ideally wrap up before the end of the year. And this year we're only going to be talking about 11, which is really good because that means that I've been focusing more on wrapping up and continuing on with series as opposed to just starting them and leaving them open-ended. We are going to be splitting this video down into 3 sections, which is of course going to be all of the series that I finished, all of the ones I'm currently up to date on, so I've read everything that's published but the series itself is not concluded, and everything that I have DNF'd. If there is a series you know I'm in the middle of that I don't mention in either of these videos, it's because I have not read a book from that series this year, therefore it does not count towards any of my progress for 2026. So getting straight into it, we may as well start off with the series that I finished, because why not start with a celebration? This year I have finished 5 series, which I'm really proud of because at this point last year I'd only finished 2, which is wild. I don't feel like I'm prioritizing sequels a lot, but I am clearly making a lot more progress this year than I was last year. So the first of those series is the Lycanius trilogy by James Islington. I'm pretty sure that I only read the final installment in 2026, and I think it was actually one of the first books that I read this year. This one is an adult epic fantasy trilogy that is set in this world where there used to be these godlike creatures called augurs, and they were overthrown. They used to form like all of the government, they were the rulers of the world, and there was a rebellion and they were overthrown because they became untrustworthy. So now people with magical abilities are heavily restricted and policed, and there are a group of people called the Gifted who have similar ability to the augurs but to a much lesser degree, and our main character Davian is one of those. However, his abilities are not manifesting the way that they're supposed to, and he is about to fail the trials that they have in this world that allow you to use your gifted abilities in service to the community and like the government that we have set up in here. So just before those trials, Davian is sure that he's about to fail, and a stranger approaches him with an artifact and says that Davian may actually be an augur and he should travel to the north of the world because they need augurs to reinforce this magical barrier that is holding all of the monsters and the bad things of the world at bay. There were quite a few things that I really enjoyed about this series. One of my favorite things about James Islington is the way that his worlds are very complex, and there is always a layer underneath what you think you know about the world, which makes him very akin to Brandon Sanderson in that regard for me. And I also love how everything comes full circle with his plots. The majority of his, I say majority because there was one big thing in here that we kind of didn't follow up on, and then we did at the end. It's like, oh yeah, this is going to be a separate story. that hasn't been written yet, but it kind of was left hanging in the middle of this series. But aside from that, I like how he ties up all of his plot threads. The ending of all of his books that I've read have been so dynamic and so memorable, which I didn't think was going to be the case with the last book in this series, because it's normally something really big that leads you into the next book. And with this being, or the last book being, a conclusion, I expected it to be a little calmer, but he still managed to deliver a dynamic ending that pretty much saved the series for me, because the thing that I don't love about this series is that it is heavily inspired by Wheel of Time, and James Islington really wears those references on his sleeve. We have a lot of similarities with the world. There's like a reptilian race in here that reminds me of like a very small part of the Wheel of Time series, and I think that James Islington went a little bit too hard emulating Robert Jordan's writing, because this series is written very differently, in my opinion, to The Will of the Many, which is one of my favorite books. I loved it so much, and because of that, because of the pacing and the writing being so reminiscent of Wheel of Time, I did find this series a little bit tedious to get through in parts. But I am glad that I read this one, because it's one that I had ongoing for a while and I had to reread book one to continue. I then finished the Of Blood and Bone series by John Gwynne, which once again is a series where I only read the final book in 2026. This one is the follow-up to the Faithful and the Fallen series as well. It's set in the same world but 150 years later, and this is one of the series that we read for Catch Up Book Club this year, because we've read through the entirety of John Gwynne's work. So this one in particular deals with the repercussions of the events of The Faithful and the Fallen, so I can't go into it too much. The Faithful and the Fallen is a very classic epic fantasy story dealing with the forces of good and evil. There used to be giants that roamed the world, and there is this ancient giant prophecy that says that an avatar for good and an avatar for evil are going to rise, and the world is going to split and rally between one of them. And throughout The Faithful and the Fallen, we follow these avatars as well as a bunch of other different characters as the prophecy plays out. So this one is set like 150 years later, and it deals with things like how power can corrupt people, how the good choice is not necessarily the actual good choice, it's just the lesser of two evils, and how while the solution to what was going on in The Faithful and the Fallen may have been the best solution that they could come to at the time, it does not mean that that is the ideal outcome for the world as a whole, especially when you're talking about the like average citizen of this world. I actually really enjoyed this one. I thought that it was very different to The Faithful and the Fallen, especially in terms of the pace and the focus, and for all intents and purposes, The Faithful and the Fallen is a very like classic epic fantasy series with classic epic fantasy themes, and this one dealt with a lot more societal topics under the surface, such as, like I said, the imbalance of power and the abuse of power, and also had some horror elements to it that I really enjoyed. So quite different tonally from The Faithful and the Fallen, and The Faithful and the Fallen is still my favourite of John Gwynne's series, but I did still really have a good time with this one. I then finished the Five Broken Blades series, which was the final series that I finished in the first half of the year. Once again, I only read the final installment in this one in 2026, and this one is an adult multi-perspective fantasy heist story following 5 people who desperately want something and have nothing to lose, and so they sign on to what is essentially a suicide mission to try and kill the king. They are traveling in pairs throughout the first book leading up to this assassination attempt, so they're getting to know some of the people that they're maybe going to be working with, and they all also have a unique skill that makes them perfectly suited for this task. As I've said before, this story does not really do anything new for fantasy heist storylines. It is very much a standard installment within that subgenre. I did find it to be very entertaining and enjoyable though, especially throughout the first 2 books. The stakes in here are quite high. I enjoyed that we had quite a few like plot twists and betrayals, and I also really like that Mike Holland is not afraid to kill her characters, which is something I don't think we see enough of in more commercial popular fantasy these days, if I'm being honest. Unfortunately though, I didn't love the last installment in this series. While I think that this is a fun time and it's entertaining, and I would recommend the audiobook because it is full cast, I don't feel like there was enough character development or progression from the beginning of this this series to the end, and the whole thing just kind of felt one note, which got a little bit tedious to me after a while. I then finished a series which I think is going to be one of my favorite series of all time, even though I only gave the books in this series 4 stars as opposed to like a 5, and that is the Her Majesty's Royal Coven series by Juno Dawson. And once again, this is a series where I just read the final installment this year. So this one is a contemporary fantasy series following a group of women who are all witches, and they all grew up together in a northern English town called Hebden Bridge. And one of them is now the High Priestess of Her Majesty's Royal Coven, which is the governing body of witches, and she has discovered a prophecy that says that the Sullied Child is going to summon a demon that brings about the end of days. And she also thinks that she has found the Sullied Child that is the key to this prophecy. So she gets in touch with her childhood best friend Neve and asks her to rehabilitate this child that they've found that is very volatile and also unwilling to communicate or cooperate with anybody within Her Majesty's Royal Coven. This sets off a whole chain of events that all of our characters, all of these women that grow up together, get dragged into, as well as some of the younger characters we have included the Sullied Child themselves and some of the children of some of our older main characters. The thing that I loved the most about this series, and I've talked about it a lot over the last couple of months, but especially in the final book, I loved the characters and the character development in this series. The women that we follow in here are already in their mid-30s, and they've already lived the events of a fantasy series before we even get to this one, because they had a very big role to play in a war between the witches and the warlocks that happened in their early 20s that has left scars on all of them. Like, all of them suffered very traumatic events throughout that war, and so they all already have a lot of baggage before we get to the chaotic events of this plot, which obviously piles a whole lot more on top of them. And I really loved that all of the characters were multifaceted and layered because they'd already lived through so much before we got to this series, but then also all of the events that happen in this series add on top of that and help to build them into the people that they are at the end of this series. There was also a great deal of resilience shown by the main characters and a willingness to go on, like a hopeful outlook, even in spite of everything that had happened in this series and before, which I really admired. But I honestly just think that Juno Dawson did such a good job of portraying realistic characters. I feel like we read a lot of characters in fantasy where nothing has ever happened to them pretty much up until the point the series starts, so they're a clean slate ready for the events of the series. And I think it was really interesting to have characters that have already been through a lot, but also everything that they've been through adds a layer to their character that makes them feel like realistic, fully fleshed out people. The final series that I finished is The Legends of Thesma by Helen Shara. The first book was a reread for me, and I can't remember whether I reread it this year or at the end of last year, but the rest of the series I read and completed within 2026. This one is a romantasy series that we were reading for my Patreon book club, and it follows a woman who wants to be one of the warriors of Thesma. However, there is a prophecy in this world that says a daughter of darkness, or the daughter of darkness, will wield a blade that brings about the end of days, and so all women have been banned from training. So there's no female warriors of Thesma anymore, and our main character ends up petitioning the royalty of the world to let her in through a loophole, which they do eventually agree to, and she starts to train with some of the legends of Thesma, who are the elite warriors, including the most reclusive and surly legend of Thesma, who is Wilder Hawthorne. I really enjoyed book 1 in this series both times that I read it, but I was disappointed by the second book, which was extremely smut heavy and kind of killed any investment that I had in this series. I did continue on though because it was my Patreon book club series, and even though my level of investment in the series disappeared with book 2, I do think that book 3 and book 4 were much stronger installments in the series, and I think that the series wrapped up like really satisfyingly. It's a real shame about book 2 because I find when there's something that kind of knocks my focus on a book or a series or really puts me off, it's really hard for me to kind of come back around and get reinvested. So even though I can acknowledge that book 3 and book 4 were a lot stronger and book 4 was probably the best installment in the series, it's not a series that I look back on favorably. I probably wouldn't recommend it, and overall I didn't have the best time with it. So next up we'll talk about the DNFs, I guess, because that is the other category that is quite final. I'll never be revisiting these series again, so this is probably one of the last times that you will ever hear me talk about them. As I said, last year I had 12 series that I DNF'd, and this year we once again have 5. We're actually very evenly split across all 3 sections of this video with 5 series for each one, which is quite nice. And while it is a good thing to DNF, because it's a good thing to acknowledge I'm not going to come back to this, I'm not invested enough, obviously the less series I DNF means that I'm enjoying more of what I'm reading, as opposed to not enjoying it to the point where I don't want to continue. So a lot of these I obviously don't own, and the first series that I DNF'd was the Gods and Monsters series by Amber V. Nicole. I read the first book this year, and it was one that I was very excited about actually, because I'd heard a lot of really good things. I am not going to be able to give you the most information on these right now because DNFing them for the most part means that I'm not super invested, and so they weren't really very memorable to me. But I remember that this one was an urban fantasy, and we were following a woman who was a monster or part monster who worked essentially as an assassin for somebody else, and she ends up switching sides and working for a god in order to protect her sister and gain a safe life for her sister, whereas the other guy that she was working for was kind of just holding her sister over her head to force her to do their bidding. So I actually really enjoyed the world in this one. I've been enjoying a lot of urban fantasy recently. I thought that that was a genre that I really didn't like, but I actually don't like older series of that genre because of some of the outdated elements. But when you bring that kind of story and pair it with some more modern themes, tropes and characters, I found that I've been quite enjoying it, and this was not an exception. However, I did not care about the romantic relationships at all, and I did find that the adjustment from not really knowing each other to starting to like each other more, to being friends, to being something more happened very quickly, and I didn't feel any chemistry between them at all. So obviously going through the rest of the series knowing that we were going to be focusing on their relationship for the entire thing was not something that I really cared about. And I also found that this started to drag at a certain point in the book, whereas at the beginning I thought that it was quite easy to get invested in. It did start to lose my interest partway through that book as well. I also have really sadly DNF'd the Fae and Alchemy series by Callie Hart. When I read Quicksilver earlier this year, I was undecided whether I was going to continue, but in doing like the research and the prep to make this video, I've decided that the likelihood of me continuing on with this are very slim, given that there's other series that I would rather give my time and attention to. A lot of you guys will already be familiar with this one, but it is once again a romantasy series. This one is set in a world that is sectioned off kind of like the spokes of a clock, with the capital being in the middle, and once again details a little bit hazy, but our main character ends up going through a portal into the Feylands where she meets the love interest Kingfisher. I really liked the writing in this, in that it was compelling and easy to get into. I felt like it had a lot of common themes and tropes of the romantasy genre, but with just a little bit of a different spin on them to make them a little bit more intriguing. And I liked especially the fact that the magic in this world had to do with Quicksilver, which of course we also know of as mercury, and that is a substance that used to be used in hat making, which is how we get the Mad Hatter character in Alice in Wonderland. So I really liked that we had the unstable character of Kingfisher who had been affected by his use of Quicksilver, and I thought that that was really clever and interesting. However, I did not like the romance in this at all. I thought that all of the romantic events in this book were very jarring. It felt like we went from 0 to 100 in a scene. Like there would be no tension, no build up. They'd be standing next to each other and then they were making out, and it just felt really out of place to me. And I thought that the sex scenes were also really dramatic and over the top. So once again, this is a case of I enjoyed the world, I enjoyed the plot, but the fact that I know that this is a romantasy series and it's going to focus on the romance kind of killed the vibe for me a little bit, and I just don't think I care enough to pursue the series, especially having heard a lot of negative reviews of the sequel, which I think is called Brimstone. In comparison to Quicksilver, it just doesn't really seem like it's something that's worth me pursuing. I've also DNF'd the Cemetery of Forgotten Books series by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. The first book in this one is The Shadow of the Wind. Now, I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly when I looked up the sequel, all of these stories in this series are different, following different characters. They just all center around the Cemetery of Forgotten Books, which is where obscure or lost books are hidden, and our main character of the first book goes to the Cemetery of Forgotten Books with his father. It's like a rite of passage, and he gets to select a book. And the book that he selects sends him on this kind of wild goose chase to find out about the author's life. Because essentially there is a figure going around burning all of this author's books, and when they find out that our main character has access to one, they try to acquire that from him, and it inspires the main character to look deeper into this author's life to try and find out more about him, because he's essentially a very cult author. He wasn't very popular, especially at the time that he was writing, but now there seems to be this very like clandestine cult following and like fan club of his books. This was also a coming of age story following our main character as he is navigating crushes and relationships and puberty and all of that for the first time. And I did find that it was really interesting. This is, I can't remember what genre this is. It's like a historical or literary thriller, something along those lines, and I thought that the development of the plot was really interesting in terms of learning about the author and the figure that's trying to burn the books. Like, all of that plot line did interest me, but the book was actually more focused on the coming of age story and following the like day-to-day life of this like teenage boy. I think it's from his mid-teenage years up until his early 20s, and that aspect and that focus I was a lot less interested in. So while I had a positive experience with the book overall, I probably won't pursue any more books in this series. I then very sadly DNF'd the Fates Thread series by Sophie Kim, with book 1 being The God and the Gumiho. This is the book that I read in Korea because when I travel I like to read fantasy books that are inspired by the lore, the mythology, or like set in the country that I'm visiting. And this one was heavily inspired by K-dramas. That is what Sophie Kim was trying to emulate in the writing of this book. It is following a god whose brother has kicked him out of his kingdom for betraying him, and he said that if he kills this many people and returns this certain amount of souls to the underworld, he will be allowed to return. And he's pursuing this when a demon of darkness escapes the underworld. So then the god's brother thinks that this legendary Gumiho called, I think the Scarlet Fox, is in league with the demon of darkness. He sends the god to kill both the demon and the Scarlet Fox, and if he does so, he will be allowed back into his kingdom immediately. However, what he does not know is that the Gumiho, the Scarlet Fox, is actually the barista at the local coffee shop, and she, after learning that he is going to be trying to hunt her down, gets a job as his assistant and assists him in his quest to get to the bottom of this plot line, mainly so that she can save her own skin, but also because she did not actually commit the murder that she has been framed for. So this one I just never really got into. I really struggled with immersing myself in this one. I thought it lacked a little bit of atmosphere, and in terms of it being a romantic focused story, where the focus of this is definitely more on the plot, but it does have a romantic element that leads heavily into the sequel, I felt like the romantic relationship fell a little bit flat, and I also felt like it lacked tension. And given that this is so heavily trying to emulate a K-drama, all of the ones that I've seen are super slow burn. They have so much longing. It takes like 6 episodes for their hands to brush, and I just felt like the relationship between these two characters shifted really quickly and the build-up was lacking for me. So knowing that it has such a strong romantic presence that is going to influence the plot of the sequel, I don't really want to continue on and read that. And then the last series that I've DNF'd in this quarter is The Last Fenestra by Emily Thaidi, which I actually had a really good time with this book. I really enjoyed it, but I felt like the plot leading into the sequel was just shoehorned into the end, and it left me with no desire to actually continue on and read that sequel. And I've actually heard from quite a few of you guys that the second book isn't as good as the first, so I'm quite happy to just leave it here. But this is essentially following a woman who is the Fenestra, and that is a person who is chosen every generation or every 25 years, it's somewhere along those lines, to amplify the power of somebody with magical abilities so that they can join together and fight back the horde of demons that infiltrates the island that they live on every generation / 25 years. However, our main character's powers are a little bit faulty, and instead of amplifying the power of the person that she's joined with, she actually keeps accidentally killing them. There's also an element of ceremony to this where the Fenestra marries the person whose powers she's going to amplify, and at the point where we start this, she's moving on to her third spouse, and the people are getting scared because this demon horde are approaching, like it's going to be happening soon, and they have no line of defense. So there is a priest that rises up and says that the Fenestra has to be killed so that another one can come to power, so they stand a chance of surviving. So our main character goes down into the slums of the city and finds somebody in an underground fighting ring to protect her because even her guards are turning on her. This was very nostalgic to me in that it reminded me of old school fantasy romance, the kind of thing that made me fall in love with the genre. In terms of like the structure and the pacing and the way that it unfolded, it reminded me a lot of things like Throne of Glass, and it also, with the plotline of like this horde that is going to come and decimate the land, it reminded me a lot of Shield of Sparrows by Devney Perry, which was one of my favorite books of last year, and the sequel is one of my favorite books of this year, which we're going to be talking about very, very soon. I also thought that it was quite refreshing to read a book that was paced and structured like this, given that I feel like the fantasy romance and the romancy genre is a little bit different now in the way that it's executed. I find that it tends to be more fast-paced, more heavily romance focused as opposed to fantasy. So I really liked reading a book that was a little bit more nostalgic in that way. However, like I said, the plot at the end of this just felt shoehorned in. It felt like the author was being intentionally vague about some of the elements of the world, like where did the demon horde come from? Why does it come here to decimate the land? These are things that we know in Shield of Sparrows, that the author tells us to flesh out the background of this world. And these are questions that we never get any answers to or are never asked until right at the end when we need a reason to go into the sequel. And it just felt a little bit rushed. It also had a trope that is really frustrating me at the minute, right at the end. So while I had a really good time with this one and would recommend giving it a try if it's on your radar, I once again don't think I am ever going to get around to picking up the sequel, so we may as well just call it a DNF now. And then finally we have the series that I'm currently up to date on. So this means that I have read everything that has been published in this series thus far, but it is currently an incomplete series. This year I have 5 of these to talk about, which is an improvement from the 3 that I spoke about at this point last year. However, I don't feel like that's too much of an achievement because only one of these series is one that I have continued to keep up with as it's being published. The rest of them are just ones that I've started this year, and there's only one book currently published in the series and is set to publish for the rest of the year. So we'll start with the one that is the biggest achievement, which is of course Shield of Sparrows by Devney Perry. I read this one last year. It was one of my favorite books of last year and one of the best romancy books that I've read in a very, very long time. And I also read the sequel very shortly after it was published, which was Rights of the Starling. And it is so rare these days for a sequel to be on par with book 1 in my opinion, and for me to love them both. Rights of the Starling did not disappoint. So this one is an adult romantasy, and it's set in a world where every generation there is a migration of giant eagle-like monsters that fly over the land and decimate everything in their path. To combat this, the humans have set up a treaty called the Shield of Sparrows, which is essentially a marriage alliance between kingdoms designed to keep the peace amongst the humans so that they can concentrate on banding together and fighting back against the monsters. Our main character is not supposed to be the sparrow for her generation, but because of a loophole, the kingdom that she is being married into have been allowed to choose their bride instead of her father choosing which of his daughters is going to fulfill the treaty. And so our main character marries the crown prince of this different kingdom, and she travels there to live out the rest of her days. However, her father has revealed that he's been training her sister her entire life to infiltrate this kingdom and feed him information on where their secret capital city lies. And he says that his motives are to help end the migration for good. However, our main character hasn't had a great relationship with her father at any point in her life, and as she travels to this new kingdom and she becomes quite fond of the people who live there, and also gets a little bit more freedom, can explore the communities, learns a little bit more about the monsters, because they're not just eagles, there's different types of monsters as well. She starts to question her father's motivations even more as she becomes more and more enamored not only by this country, but by this country's legendary monster hunter, the Guardian, who unfortunately for her is not her husband. One of my favorite things about this series is that it has a very conventional romancy setup, and I feel like Devney Perry uses that to lull you into a false sense of security that really lays the groundwork for a bunch of plot twists that we have throughout this series. It has a lot of very common, familiar, popular themes and tropes of the romancy genre, but then builds upon them and does something a little bit different, where Devney Perry puts a little bit of a unique twist on this world. And in terms of the sequel, something that I really loved is that I expected the sequel to progress the plot, given that this book is a very traditional setup story that has a dynamic end that I thought was going to lead into the development of like the true plot of the series. But what Devney Perry actually does is takes a step back and further develops the world in a very interesting and unconventional way that once again led to some shocking revelations. It is so rare for books, especially within the romancy genre, to take me by surprise these days, and I love that Devney Perry continues to do that, but also maintains a realistic and compelling level of tension within the romantic relationship that lasts throughout that second book as well, because I find that if the relationship is a done deal at the end of book one, I kind of lose all interest in the romance in the sequel. So I really love that Devney Perry found a way to maintain that tension without it feeling really contrived or unrealistic. So this, so far, top tier romancy series for me. So excited for book 3 next year. And if you have not read this yet and you're a romancy fan, especially of like the good old classics, would definitely recommend that you give this one a go. I'm also currently up to date with the Eternal Path series by Antonia Hodgson. Unfortunately for me, only the first book in this series has currently been released. This is also one of my favorite books of this year, and this one is a little bit of a murder mystery actually. We pick up this book where the Emperor is about to retire, and as is customary in this world, he organizes a tournament where a representative of each of the monasteries in the world will compete to become the next emperor. All of the monasteries represent one of the animal gods. So you have like a raven, a bear, a fox, amongst a whole host of other things. And our main character that we're following is Nima, who is a scholar from the Raven Monastery. And she has to step in and investigate when the Raven candidate is murdered just before the start of the tournament. This is once again a case of an author lulling you into a false sense of security, which really allows for some dynamic plot twists. I really love the slow pacing in this, as well as the fact that it feels so organically fantasy with the complexity and the richness of this world, as well as the atmosphere, which honestly shocked me when I found out that Antonia Hodgson's background is actually in crime writing, not in fantasy at all. And while that was surprising when it comes to the world building, I feel like Antonia Hodgson's experience with the crime genre really shows in the way that the plot unfolds in this one. The twists were delivered in a way where they didn't feel like twists. It felt like misdirection, which is something I'm very familiar with from Brandon Sanderson, where you're essentially being distracted by something interesting and shiny to distract you from thinking about or looking at the actual crucial information that would lead you to unraveling the plot. While this does have a murder mystery, which is not one of my favorite things, I think the fact that it combined a really slow build with rich atmosphere and complex world building with plot twists that took me by surprise and a really like well thought out intricate plot is what won me over in this one, and I'm really excited to continue on when the sequel is published next year. So the next 3 series and the last 3 in this section are ones that I am currently up to date on, And at this point, there is a possibility that I will continue, but I also would not be surprised if by the time the sequel to these books rolls around, I've kind of lost interest in them. They are books that are like a 3.5 star for the most part. There is one that is an exception. So I enjoyed them enough while I was reading them that I have thought about continuing, but I just don't know if my level of investment is there at this point, and that is a decision that I'm going to make when the sequels are actually announced or released. So the first of these is We Who Will Die by Stacia Stark. This one is once again a romantasy. It is not outside of the ordinary for the romantasy genre though. I thought that it was interesting and engaging, but I wouldn't say that it did anything especially new or was overly compelling or was especially unique. So this is one that is inspired by the Roman Empire and also contains vampires, and it follows a main character who is offered something she can't refuse if she enters a competition to become one of the Emperor's elite guards to put her in a position to be close enough to the Emperor to kill him. We also have a love triangle in here, with one of the love interests being the captain of the king's, like, or the Emperor's current guard, and with our second love interest being the evil but potentially misunderstood son of the Emperor. The thing that intrigued me the most about this is the love triangle, if I'm being honest. The why choose trope is incredibly popular at the moment, which is not one that I'm a fan of because I always have a preference, so I'm always begging the main character to choose. And so I really loved seeing a good old-fashioned love triangle where I can really get invested in who the main character is going to end up with. I also really love a fantasy series that is inspired by the Roman Empire, and while this wasn't the most unique, interesting use of that inspiration, I did enjoy its influence on the story. So this one was like a 3.5 romantasy for me. There are other series that I enjoy much more than this that I'm more excited to continue on with, but I did enjoy this one enough that I may consider carrying it on. We then have the Book of Fallen Leaves. This one is the first book in the Autumn Empire series. It's adult epic fantasy, and it has been pitched as Game of Thrones with samurai, which I do think is a pretty accurate description because it is essentially following the aftermath of a failed rebellion. So the patriarch of a family decided he wanted to overthrow the Emperor. He's one of the families or one of the people that was closest to the Emperor, but he didn't think that the way that power was being distributed was fair. So he tried to overthrow the Empire and he failed. So he was killed. His daughter was taken as like a political hostage kind of situation. His son was thought dead, and his brother, who is somebody who was always wanted to do the right thing, he's a very noble character, has maintained his position and is now the like captain of the guard. All of these are main perspectives, like the children and the brother are all main perspectives that we follow in here, because the noble houses are once again trying to rise up and overthrow the empire. So on one side you have the father of the emperor, who is the one who's actually instigating this rebellion because he believes that the emperor's advisor, who I think is a Grand Chancellor? Yes, he's the Grand Chancellor of State, is the guy who actually holds all of the power and is trying to consolidate more power for himself. So the father of the emperor is trying to incite this rebellion to get rid of the Grand Chancellor so that he doesn't have all of the power in the world, which he is very close to doing through either being the chancellor or putting his children in positions of power or marrying into families that like will allow him to have more power. I thought that this one had a lot of potential, but it didn't really do anything that wowed me. I did really enjoy the Japanese influence on this story, and my favorite thing about it was the world building and the atmosphere. But story-wise, I thought that this was a really good setup novel. I would just have to read more from this series to see how it builds upon that to kind of form my any like kind of concrete verdict on this one. Like, it was enjoyable, but I don't feel like it did enough. The character perspectives, half of them I really enjoyed, half of them I wasn't as interested in. So I would be interested in continuing on with this series because I feel like oftentimes with epic fantasy it is the second book that really sets the tone for the rest of the series if it does a good job of building on the foundations of book one. But without any access to book two right now, I can't make that decision, so this is pretty much going to hinge on whether I remember enough about this this when book 2 is released to continue on, or whether I'm invested enough to reread if I need to continue on with book 2. I guess we'll see what happens. And then the final series that we're going to talk about is a little bit of an outlier, because I would actually say that this is one of my least favorite books of the year, but the last 2 chapters were so good that I am slightly interested in continuing on with the sequel. And this is one that I also read super recently, so I do think there is a pretty big chance that by the time the sequel is released I won't care as much anymore. But right now I'm still reeling from the end of Daggermouth by H.M. Wolf. So this one is a super popular, super hyped dystopian romance duology that has just been traditionally published. It was indie published at the beginning of the year and it became popular pretty much overnight. So it was picked up and has just been traditionally re-released. And it's set in this world that is separated into 3 rings. It's essentially this big city, and in the center you have the heart where the elite live. Then you have the cardinal where you have your skilled workers like lawyers and doctors, and then everybody else lives in the boundary. But you also have the smugglers, the thieves, and the assassins. And our main character Shadira is a Daggermouth, which is an assassin, and she is given a contract to assassinate the president's son. And now everybody who lives in the heart, all of the elite, all wear masks, and the only people who are allowed to see your face unmasked are your family members or people you are married to. They call it the vow in this world. And when Shadira goes to assassinate Grayson, he removes his mask because he is actually a rebel sympathizer and his family are actually pretty awful. So when she comes to assassinate him, he's like, yeah, go for it, I don't really care. And all of these security forces burst in and his family become aware that he has revealed himself to this assassin. And so they exploit a loophole within the law that says if somebody accidentally sees you without your mask, you can then marry them afterwards and that would make it okay. So Shadira and Grayson are forced to marry each other with the president holding something over both of their heads to force them to comply. There are quite a few things that I didn't love about this book. One of them is that while this is a dystopian series, I don't feel like it had anything super poignant or significant to say or critique about society outside of very basic notions like capitalism is bad, segregation is bad, you shouldn't oppress people. And I also feel like it read a lot more like a crime family or mafia romance than it did a dystopian. Given that the city itself is not incredibly different from modern society, like it's not super far removed, which is fine, but we had a lot of things like bomb threats, terrorism, and gun violence in here that was very reminiscent of like crime and mafia romance stories to me. And I very much feel like if you remove the very slight dystopian influence on this, if you put this in a real world city, it would have functioned perfectly well as a crime or mafia romance as opposed to a dystopian. My other issue is that I don't care about the main characters at all. They're very two-dimensional in that they're more symbols or caricatures than they are characters. We have the badass assassin who's from the wrong part of the city. She wants revenge on the ruling family because they killed her family. And then we also have the son of the most influential person in this system who is incredibly privileged but also is a rebel sympathizer, which are very common archetypes that we have seen before. And I also feel like in terms of the plot of this book, anything meaningful that happens is not achieved by the main characters, it's achieved by these side characters who not only had more compelling romances than our main characters, but also were much more interesting, well-developed characters than our main characters. All that being said, the last 2 chapters of this book were 5 stars. Enough that I'm intrigued about what happens in book 2, but knowing that the 2 main characters are regarded as the main characters of this series, and the fact that they didn't actually do very much in this first book implies to me that they are going to have a more prominent role in book 2, and as they are the thing that I care about the least in this series, I don't know if I'm going to go into book 2, but if everything else would have been on the same caliber as those last 2 chapters, I would have loved this book because they blew me away, but unfortunately there was too much about this that I didn't like. So this is once again a case of when the sequel is released, maybe I'll care enough Maybe I won't, but I'm pretty sure that by the end of the year we'll have a verdict, and maybe this will have moved into the DNF section of my end of year series wrap up. So those are all of the series that I've either finished, I'm up to date on, or have DNF'd so far in 2026. The next installment, as I said, is going to be the 11 series that I need to continue on with. So they have books that have been published that I haven't read, whether they are finished series or ones that are still currently being published. I am very pleased to report though that we only have, I think, 11 or 12 of those going forward, which is an improvement on the 18 that we had at this point last year. So I'm definitely progressing on more with series, finishing more series than I am starting them and leaving them hanging this year, which is great. That is what we want. And hopefully that trajectory continues for the rest of the year. Actually, since the end of the first half of the year, so essentially in July, I have started a series, finished a series. The current book that I'm reading is the first book in a series, and the next book that I'm reading is the last book in a series. So we have a 1-for-1 ratio going on to kick us off for that second half of 2026. But I do hope that you are enjoying this mid-year content. You also have my best books of the year so far and my mid-year book freakout tag to catch up on if you've missed those. And down in my comments, let me know what the last series you finished was so far this year. But aside from that, if you guys would like to let me know you were here but you don't feel like you have anything to say, then leave me a flower emoji for the cover of Shield of Sparrows. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram, or my Patreon if you want to follow me on any of those. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.